The morning was cold and quiet. The clouds hung low, covering the sky like a heavy blanket. The streets were wet from a light rain that had fallen through the night. A few cars rolled by, splashing through puddles. Daniel walked along the cracked sidewalk with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He kept his head down, not wanting to meet anyone's eyes. It had been a long time since he'd had the energy to smile at anyone. Once people used to wave at him when he passed by. They used to bring their cars to his small garage at the corner of Maple Street. He had been the kind of man who loved what he did. He worked hard, never complained, and treated everyone fairly. But those days were gone. The garage had closed nearly a year ago after the owner sold it to a large company. The new management brought their own people, and Daniel was left standing outside with a small box of his tools, wondering what to do next. At first, he tried to stay positive. He had experience, and he was good at his job. He thought finding another mechanic position would be easy. But weeks turned into months, and every shop he went to said the same thing. They weren't hiring. The rejection hit him harder each time. Slowly, his savings began to disappear. He sold a few of his belongings, but it wasn't enough. The rent went unpaid, the bills piled up, and the arguments at home became unbearable. His wife had tried to stay strong, but stress changes people. Their conversations turned into fights. He could see the disappointment in her eyes. One night she told him she couldn't live like this anymore. She packed her things, took their son, and left. Daniel didn't stop her. He didn't have the strength to. He watched the car drive away and felt something inside him go quiet. It was like a part of him had shut down completely. Now he lived in a small room above an old bakery that had closed years ago. The room smelled faintly of flour and yeast. The paint was peeling and the window rattled when the wind blew, but it was cheap and that was all he could afford. He had a small bed, a chair, and a lamp that flickered sometimes. Every morning he woke up to silence. He made instant coffee, stared at the wall for a while, and tried to convince himself to keep going. That morning, he had gone for another job interview. It was a small workshop on the other side of town. He had put on his cleanest shirt and tried to look hopeful. But the owner barely looked at him. The man asked a few questions, nodded politely, and ended with the same words Daniel had heard too many times before. "We'll call you." He knew they wouldn't. They never did. When he stepped outside, the drizzle had started again. He didn't even bother opening his umbrella. He just walked, letting the rain soak into his jacket and drip from his hair. The road home was long and mostly empty. Old warehouses lined one side, and a row of leafless trees stretched along the other. As he walked, his thoughts wandered back to his son. The boy had loved spending weekends in the garage, helping hand over wrenches, pretending to be a mechanic. He used to say, "Guy, when I grow up, I'm going to fix cars just like you, Dad." The memory hit Daniel hard. He wondered if his son still said that now, or if he had stopped talking about him altogether. A few cars passed him on the wet road, spraying water from their tires. Then up ahead, Daniel noticed something unusual. A car pulled over to the side with its hazard lights blinking. A man stood next to it, bent over a flat tire, struggling to loosen the bolts. Daniel slowed his steps. For a moment, he thought about walking past. It wasn't his problem. He was cold, wet, and tired. But then he thought about how many times people had helped him when he needed it. Something inside him refused to ignore the sight. He crossed the road carefully, the puddles splashing around his boots. "Need some help?" he called out. The man looked up, surprised. He was in his 50s, wearing a coat that was soaked through. "I'd appreciate it," he said with a nervous laugh. "This thing isn't cooperating." Daniel crouched down next to the tire. He saw right away what the problem was. The wrench the man was using was the wrong size and the bolts were rusted tight. "Mind if I give it a try?" he asked. The man nodded and stepped aside. Daniel picked up the wrench, adjusted it, and leaned his weight into it. With a sharp twist, the bolt loosened. One by one, he removed them, replaced the tire with the spare, and tightened everything back up. The rain kept falling, but Daniel didn't care. His hands moved with a kind of rhythm, the kind that came from years of doing this kind of work. He didn't need to think about it. For a few minutes, he felt like his old self again. The man who knew what he was doing, the man people trusted. When he finished, he stood up and wiped his hands on his coat. "You're all set," he said. The man smiled with relief. "Thank you so much," he said. "I've been stuck here for half an hour. My name's Robert, by the way." Daniel nodded slightly. Glad to help. Take care out there. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out some money. Please let me pay you for your time, he insisted. Daniel shook his head immediately. No, that's okay. I didn't do it for that. Robert looked at him for a moment as if he wanted to say more, but then he simply smiled and said, You don't meet people like you often. You might have just made my day. Daniel gave a small nod and started walking again. His coat was heavy with rain. His shoes squelched with every step, but his chest felt lighter than it had in months. It wasn't just about fixing a tire. It was about feeling useful again. For a moment, the noise in his head went quiet. He had done something that mattered, even if it was small. When he reached his room that evening, the rain had finally stopped. The sky outside was a dull shade of purple fading into night. He hung his wet coat on a hook and sat on the edge of his bed. The room felt the same as always, but something inside him was different. He poured himself a cup of water, stared at his reflection in the window, and felt the faintest hint of pride. It had been so long since he'd felt that. Later, as he lay on his bed listening to the soft dripping of rain outside, he thought about Robert. He wondered where he was going, who he was meeting, and why he was alone on that road. He didn't know, and maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had stopped to help. He could have walked by, but he didn't. And somehow that small decision made him feel alive again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, bright and warm. Daniel got up earlier than usual. He made coffee and stepped outside, feeling the cool air against his face. The street was busy again, people rushing to work, kids laughing on their way to school. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel like an outsider. He was still struggling, yes, but something had shifted. The world didn't feel quite as heavy. As he walked to the corner store, he thought about how quickly life could change. Maybe he couldn't fix everything that had gone wrong, but maybe he could start somewhere. He still had his hands, his skill, his heart. That had to count for something. He looked down the road where he had helped Robert the day before. The car was gone, but the memory of that moment stayed with him. Sometimes, he thought, life has a strange way of giving back what you think you've lost. Maybe, just maybe, that small act of kindness would lead to something he couldn't see yet. He didn't know it, but that simple decision, to stop and help a stranger, was the beginning of the change he had been waiting for. The next few days passed slowly. Daniel went about his usual routine, waking early, drinking his weak coffee, and walking through town to look for work. He had gotten used to rejection, but somehow this week felt a little different. Ever since he helped that man on the roadside, something small but real had changed inside him. He didn't know what it was exactly, but he felt a little more awake, a little more open to the world. On Wednesday morning, he went to the local community center to check the job board. There were the same old notices: cleaning jobs, part-time delivery work, handyman ads that paid next to nothing. He stood there for a moment, staring at the wall, when he heard someone behind the counter call his name. Daniel Morris? He turned around, surprised. The woman at the desk was holding out an envelope. "This came for you yesterday," she said. Someone dropped it off. Daniel thanked her and stepped outside before opening it. Inside was a short letter and a business card. The note read, "I wanted to thank you again for helping me the other day. I wasn't able to say much then, but I'd like to speak with you about something important. Please call me if you can. Robert Hayes." The card had a company logo on it that said, Hayes Auto Group, Regional Office. Daniel stood there for a moment, reading the note twice to make sure he wasn't imagining it. He remembered the man clearly, the one with the flat tire and the friendly smile. He hadn't thought much about him since that night, but now his name was printed on an actual business card, and the words Auto Group caught his attention. Maybe it was just a thank you gesture, he thought, or maybe it was something more. Either way, he had nothing to lose. Back in his room, Daniel stared at the old phone on his table for almost an hour before dialing the number. His hands felt a little shaky as he waited for the line to connect. When he finally heard a voice on the other end, it was warm and familiar. "Daniel, I was hoping you'd call," Robert said cheerfully. "I meant what I wrote. I'd like to see you. Do you think you could come by my office tomorrow morning? I have a feeling we might be able to help each other." Daniel agreed, though his mind was full of questions. After hanging up, he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at the card again. He couldn't help but wonder what Robert meant. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but something about the man's tone gave him a strange kind of comfort. That night, for the first time in months, Daniel laid out his clothes and polished his shoes before bed. The next morning, the sun was out and the air was crisp. Daniel walked the 3 miles to the address on the card, a modest office building near the industrial park. The sign out front matched the logo on the card. He paused outside the glass doors, took a deep breath, and walked in. A young receptionist greeted him with a smile and asked him to wait. A few minutes later, Robert appeared, looking exactly as Daniel remembered him. Kind eyes, calm smile, and the same friendly energy. "Daniel, I'm really glad you came," Robert said, shaking his hand firmly. "Come on, let's talk." He led him into a small office filled with car posters, tools on display, and a faint smell of motor oil that made Daniel's heart ache with nostalgia. They sat down, and Robert leaned forward slightly. "I'll get right to it," he said. "When you helped me that night, you had no reason to. You didn't know me and you refused money. That told me a lot about who you are. You see, I run a chain of auto repair shops across the region. We've been short on good mechanics for a while. After what I saw, I knew you were the kind of person I want on my team." Daniel stared at him, speechless. He wasn't sure if he had heard right. "You're saying, you're offering me a job?" he asked slowly. Robert smiled. "I'm offering you an opportunity," he said. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise it's real. I'd like you to start at one of our local garages. We need someone with your skill and attitude." For a few seconds, Daniel couldn't speak. It felt like the world had stopped moving. He had gone from being invisible to suddenly being seen. I don't know what to say," he finally managed. Robert chuckled softly. "Say you'll give it a try," he replied. Daniel nodded, still trying to process it all. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Thank you, truly." Robert stood and shook his hand again. "Good. I'll have someone call you with the details. You start Monday morning, and Daniel," he added, pausing, "you helped me when you didn't have to. The least I can do is return the favor, but something tells me you'll do just fine." When Daniel stepped out of the building, the sunlight felt brighter than before. He walked slowly down the street, hardly believing what had just happened. It had been so long since anyone believed in him, since anyone had given him a real chance. He felt something deep in his chest, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. For the first time in almost a year, his steps felt light. That weekend, Daniel prepared himself for his new job. He cleaned his old work clothes, organized his small set of tools, and even bought a second-hand lunchbox from a thrift shop. Each small act made him feel more alive. He didn't tell anyone about the job yet. Part of him wanted to make sure it was real before saying it out loud. Monday came and Daniel arrived early at the garage Robert had mentioned. The shop was busy but friendly, filled with the sounds of clanging tools and humming engines. A man named Carl, the shop manager, greeted him and showed him around. "Robert told me about you," Carl said. "We could use someone who knows their way around an engine." Daniel nodded and got to work right away. The first car he worked on was a rusty old pickup with a broken fuel pump. His hands moved like they used to, steady, focused, certain. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, and it was strangely comforting. Hours passed quickly, and when he finally took a break, he realized he was smiling. It had been so long since work had felt this good. By the end of the week, the team had already warmed up to him. He was quiet but kind, always willing to help, and he never complained. One of the younger mechanics even said, "Man, you make this look easy." Daniel just laughed softly and said, "It's all about patience." That Friday, Robert stopped by the garage to check in. When he saw Daniel, he gave a proud nod. "Looks like you're settling in just fine," he said. Daniel smiled back. "Feels good to be useful again," he said honestly. Robert patted him on the shoulder. "You earned it." That night, Daniel walked home under the glow of the streetlights, his hands sore and his heart full. He still lived in the same small room, still had very little money, but everything felt different now. There was purpose again. The emptiness that had haunted him was slowly fading, replaced by quiet hope. Later, as he sat by the window sipping tea, he thought about how strange life could be. One small act of kindness, a simple decision to help a stranger, had turned his whole life around. He wondered if that was how the world worked, that sometimes you just had to give something good to get something good back. He didn't know for sure, but he felt grateful, deeply grateful. He looked out at the quiet street below, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and smiled to himself. Maybe this was the start of something better. Maybe after losing everything, he was finally getting his life back. The weeks that followed were some of the most meaningful Daniel had experienced in a long time. Each morning he woke up early, washed his face in the small sink by the window, and walked briskly to the garage. The routine felt good. The sound of engines, the smell of oil, and the hum of tools had become his comfort. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere again. The garage wasn't fancy, but it was honest work. The team worked like a family. They laughed, argued, shared lunches, and helped one another when a job got tough. Daniel had always been quiet, but people respected his calm nature and steady hands. He had a way of fixing things that others often gave up on. There was something about the way he listened to an engine, tilting his head slightly, that made others pause. He didn't just fix cars, he seemed to understand them. One afternoon, while he was tightening a bolt under a hood, Carl, the shop manager, came over and said, "You've got a good touch, Daniel. Robert told me you'd be an asset, and he was right. We could use more guys like you." Daniel smiled modestly. "I just try to do my part," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, well," Carl said, patting his shoulder. "Keep doing what you're doing." In the evenings, Daniel's life was simple. He'd go home, make a small meal, and sit by the window to watch the streetlights come on. Sometimes he'd see kids playing soccer in the alleyway or neighbors talking on the steps. It reminded him of the life he once had, a house, a family, laughter at the dinner table. Those memories still stung, but now they didn't feel as painful as before. Maybe it was because he was slowly becoming the person he used to be before everything fell apart. One Friday afternoon, Robert visited the garage again. The workers greeted him warmly. He always brought an easy energy into the room. When he saw Daniel, he smiled. "How's my best mechanic doing?" Daniel laughed lightly. "Just trying to keep up with the others." Robert shook his head. "You're doing more than that. I've had great feedback about your work. Actually, that's what I came here to talk about." "Do you have a minute?" They stepped outside, and Robert leaned against a car, crossing his arms. "I'm opening another branch on the east side next month. I'll need someone I can trust to help train the new guys and oversee repairs for the first few weeks. You've got the experience and you've earned my trust. What do you think?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "You want me to help manage a new shop?" "Exactly," Robert said with a grin. "It's not permanent unless you want it to be. But I think you've got leadership in you, whether you see it or not." For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. He had gone from standing on the edge of losing everything to being offered a chance like this. It almost felt unreal. "I'd be honored," he said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, you start there in 2 weeks. We'll sort out the details later. I knew you were the right guy the moment you stopped to help me." After Robert left, Daniel stood there for a while, taking it all in. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time. He felt proud, but more than that, he felt hopeful. That night, he sat down at his small table, took out an old notepad, and wrote something he hadn't written in a long time. A letter. It was addressed to his son, who he hadn't spoken to in over 3 years. He didn't write much at first. He just said he was doing okay now, that he'd found steady work, and that he hoped his son was well. He didn't expect a reply, but writing those words felt like healing. He sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel worked harder than ever at the new branch. He trained the younger workers, showed them how to handle customers, and even taught them small tricks he'd learned over the years. People listened to him. They respected him. And though he still lived simply, he began to feel a quiet pride in what he was building. One afternoon, as he was finishing a repair job, the receptionist walked over holding a small envelope. "Someone dropped this off for you," she said. Daniel wiped his hands and took it. When he saw the handwriting, his heart skipped. It was from his son. He sat down on a stool, staring at the letter for a long moment before opening it. The note inside was short but full of warmth. His son wrote that he had received Daniel's letter and was happy to hear he was doing better. He said he remembered helping his dad fix the family car years ago, and still thought of those times. And at the end, he wrote, "Maybe we can meet soon." Daniel read those words over and over. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. For the rest of the day, his mind wasn't on work. It was on that small possibility, that maybe he'd get a second chance not just at life, but at family. That weekend, they agreed to meet at a small diner near the outskirts of town. Daniel arrived early, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee he could barely sip. When his son walked in, Daniel almost didn't recognize him at first. He was taller, more mature, but the same kind eyes gave him away. They looked at each other for a moment before his son smiled and said softly, "Hey, Dad." Daniel stood unsure what to do for a second, then stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't a long or dramatic moment. It was quiet, gentle, real. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat drinking coffee, sharing small stories. His son told him about his job, his friends, his life. Daniel listened, smiling, sometimes laughing, sometimes just taking it all in. It felt like a part of his heart that had been closed for years had opened again. When they finally said goodbye, his son said, "I'm proud of you. Dad, you didn't give up." Daniel smiled, holding back tears. "I almost did," he said. "But someone helped me when I least expected it. Guess it's my turn to keep helping others." That night, Daniel walked home under the same quiet sky he had walked many times before. But this time, everything felt different. He felt whole again. The pain that used to sit in his chest had turned into something softer, gratitude. He thought about Robert, about the garage, about the life he was slowly rebuilding piece by piece. A week later, Robert visited the new branch. He found Daniel working on an old sedan, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused. "You look like a man who's found his place," Robert said. Daniel looked up and smiled. "Maybe I have," he said. "And I've got you to thank for that." Robert shook his head. "No, Daniel. You did this yourself. You just needed a door to open, and you were brave enough to walk through it." The two men shared a quiet moment, both understanding what the other meant. Then Robert said, "How about dinner, my treat?" "You've earned it." Daniel laughed. "You don't have to do that, I insist," Robert said, smiling. "Besides, I owe you more than one meal for changing the way I see people." They went out that evening, and Daniel found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of friendship again. As they talked, he realized that kindness really did have a way of circling back. Sometimes it took days, sometimes years, but it always found its way home. Later that night, Daniel sat by his window once more, the same view he'd stared at through some of his darkest days. But now the world outside looked different, not because the streets had changed, but because he had. He wasn't the same broken man who had stopped on the roadside months ago. He was a man who had found purpose again, who had learned that one small act of kindness could ripple far beyond imagination. He smiled as he thought of his son's letter, the new friends he had made, and the trust he had earned. Maybe this was what it meant to get your life back, not the things you lost, but the person you became after losing them. And as the night grew quiet, Daniel whispered softly to himself, "Sometimes, helping a stranger isn't about changing their life, it's about saving your own." Months passed, and Daniel's life continued to change in ways he never expected. The new branch had grown busy, and under his quiet but steady leadership, it had started earning a good reputation. Customers often asked for him by name, saying they trusted his work. He never let that go to his head. Instead, he saw it as a reminder of how far he'd come, and how easily it could have all been different if he hadn't stopped to help that stranger on the roadside months ago. Every morning, Daniel arrived early, long before the others. He'd unlock the doors, make coffee for the team, and take a few quiet minutes to watch the sunrise through the garage window. Those moments had become sacred to him. He didn't have much in the world, but he had peace, and that was worth more than anything else. One day, Robert stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, watching Daniel work on a car. "You never slow down, do you?" he said with a grin. Daniel wiped his hands and smiled. "Keeps me grounded," he said. Robert looked around the shop, nodding in approval. "You've turned this place around. The customer feedback, the team morale, it's all because of you." "I wanted to thank you personally," Daniel chuckled. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who gave me a chance," Robert shook his head. "I opened the door, Daniel. You walked through it. That's something a lot of people never do." They stood quietly for a moment. Then Robert said, "I've been thinking. There's a youth program starting up downtown, a community project to train young people who've had a tough start in life. They need someone who knows both the trade and what it's like to rebuild from scratch. I thought of you immediately. Would you consider helping?" Daniel was taken aback. "You think I could do that?" he asked. "I know you could," Robert said simply. "You've got more to teach than you realize." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The idea stayed in his head, the thought of helping others the way he'd been helped. He remembered how lost he had once been, how invisible he had felt, and how one person's kindness had changed everything. Maybe it was time to pass that forward. A week later, Daniel visited the community center where the program was starting. The building was old but full of energy, young men and women talking, laughing, nervous but eager. The coordinator introduced him to the group as Mr. Daniel, and a few of the kids clapped politely. He wasn't used to attention, but he smiled and said softly, "Just Daniel is fine." He started small, showing them basic things, how to check oil levels, change a tire, listen to an engine. But as days went by, the lessons became more than just about cars. He told them about patience, about learning from mistakes, and about how it's okay to start over. His voice wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried weight because it came from experience. At first, some of the young people didn't take him seriously. They thought of him as just another worker trying to give advice. But over time, they noticed how he never gave up on them, no matter how slow they were to learn. When one boy broke a tool and looked ready to quit, Daniel just said calmly, "It's fine. Everyone breaks something. The only real mistake is not trying again." Slowly, they began to trust him. They started staying after class to ask questions or just talk. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He knew what it felt like to not be heard, and he wanted to make sure they never felt that way around him. One afternoon, as he was packing up tools, a boy named Chris approached him. "Hey, Daniel," he said hesitantly. "You think someone like me could really get a job in a real shop one day?" Daniel looked at him for a long moment before replying, "You remind me of me when I was your age. I didn't have much, but I had my hands and I had a choice. Every day you get to make that choice. If you keep showing up, keep learning, yeah, I think you could do even better than me." Chris smiled shyly. "Thanks. No one ever said that to me before." That night, Daniel walked home with a lightness in his step. The city around him glowed softly under the streetlights, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not just in his work, but in helping others see their worth. As the months went on, the program flourished. Several of the young trainees started internships, and one even got a job at Robert's company. Daniel couldn't help but feel proud watching them grow. Each success reminded him of how far a little kindness could reach. One rainy evening, after finishing up at the center, Daniel decided to take a detour on his way home. He passed by the same road where he had first met Robert, the same spot where everything had begun. The rain was steady and the sky was gray, but Daniel smiled to himself. He stopped for a moment, standing there in the drizzle, remembering that night, the broken car, the stranger in need, the simple act that had unknowingly changed both their lives. He whispered quietly, "Thank you," as if the wind could carry his words to the past. The following week, Daniel received a letter from his son again. It said that he was planning to visit soon and wanted to meet some of the people Daniel had told him about from the garage. Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His son wanted to be part of his world again. Maybe, he thought, this was what healing really looked like. Not instant, not perfect, but steady and real. When his son arrived, Daniel introduced him to the team at the shop and the students at the community center. Everyone welcomed him warmly. Watching his son talk to the young trainees, Daniel felt proud in a way words couldn't describe. He realized that everything, every hardship, every long night, every lonely walk had led to this moment. Later, his father and son sat together on a bench outside the shop. His son said, "You've built something amazing. Dad, I can see why people look up to you." Daniel smiled gently. "I just try to help where I can. That's what saved me." His son nodded. "You didn't just get your life back. You gave other people a chance to get theirs too." Those words stayed with Daniel. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who made one small decision that grew into something bigger. But hearing his son say that filled him with quiet pride. Over time, Daniel's story became known around the community. People would mention the man who rebuilt his life by helping others, and new faces began showing up at the center wanting to learn. Some came because they wanted to fix cars. Others came because they just wanted hope. Daniel welcomed them all the same. He never gave big speeches or told grand stories. He just worked beside them, teaching, listening, encouraging. His calmness had a way of grounding others. He showed them that life didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful, that sometimes the cracks were what made it real. On the 1-year anniversary of the training program, Robert surprised him with a small ceremony at the garage. The trainees, staff, and even a few local business owners gathered. Robert handed Daniel a plaque that read, "For reminding us that kindness rebuilds more than engines, it rebuilds lives." The crowd clapped, and Daniel stood there, humbled. He didn't know what to say at first. Finally, he spoke softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "All I did was what someone once did for me. I just kept it going. If any of you ever get the chance to help someone, do it. You never know. It might be the moment that changes everything." The room fell quiet, and for a moment, everyone could feel the weight of his words. That night, after everyone left, Daniel stood alone in the quiet garage. The air smelled faintly of metal and rain. He looked at the plaque one more time and placed it on a small shelf near his tools. Then he smiled. He thought about where he had started, the empty room, the rejection, the loneliness, and where he was now. He had friends, work, his son, and something even deeper, peace. He finally understood that getting his life back wasn't about returning to what he lost. It was about growing into someone new. As he locked up and stepped outside, the wind carried a cool, gentle breeze. The city lights shimmered in the puddles along the street. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling grateful for everything, the pain, the lessons, the people who believed in him. And as he walked home, he thought, maybe helping a stranger wasn't just a moment of kindness. Maybe it was destiny's way of helping me find myself again. The months turned quietly into another year, and Daniel's life had found a rhythm that felt right. The garage was running smoothly, the community program had grown, and the small apartment that once felt so empty now felt like home. There was laughter again, sometimes from his son visiting, sometimes from the kids he taught, and sometimes from his co-workers sharing jokes during long shifts. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was real. Every morning, Daniel still woke up early. He made coffee, looked out the window, and reminded himself how lucky he was to see another sunrise. There was a calmness in him now that no job or money could ever buy. One chilly morning, as he was driving to work, Daniel noticed something on the side of the same road where his life had changed 2 years ago. A car had pulled over, its hazard lights flashing. A woman stood outside, looking helpless, trying to wave down passing cars. For a moment, Daniel just watched through the windshield. The scene looked almost identical to that night long ago. The broken car, the cold air, the uncertainty on a stranger's face. Without a second thought, he slowed down and pulled over. He stepped out, and the woman looked at him with relief. "Thank you for stopping," she said quickly. "I think my tire blew and I don't know what to do. My phone died and no one else stopped." Daniel smiled gently. "It's all right. Let's take a look." She watched as he crouched down to check the tire. He spoke calmly, explaining what he was doing just to make her feel at ease. He could see the same mix of frustration and worry he once felt on his own worst days. After a few minutes, he replaced the tire with the spare. When he stood up, she looked at him with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You probably saved my day." Daniel shook his head. "No need for thanks. I've been where you are. Just pay it forward when you can." She smiled softly. "I will. I promise." As Daniel drove away, he couldn't help but smile. That small act of helping a stranger had come full circle. Years ago, stopping on this very road had saved his life in ways he never could have imagined. And now here he was doing the same for someone else. It felt like life's quiet way of saying, "You've come full circle." At the garage later that day, Daniel couldn't shake the memory. He told his co-worker about it, and the man chuckled. "You really can't pass a broken-down car without helping, can you?" Daniel smiled. "Maybe I just remember what it's like to need a hand." That night, after closing up, he walked home instead of taking the bus. The air was cool and the city lights shimmered softly. He thought about all the people who had passed through his life, the strangers, the friends, the students. Each one had added something to his journey, whether they realized it or not. When he got home, there was an envelope on his table. It was from Chris, one of the first students from the training program. Inside was a handwritten letter. It said, "Hey Daniel, I wanted to tell you I got hired at a real shop last week. I wouldn't be here without you. You taught me how to fix more than cars. You taught me how to fix myself. I hope one day I can help someone the way you helped me. Thank you for believing in me." Daniel read it twice, his eyes stinging a little. He smiled and placed the letter next to the plaque Robert had given him. It felt like proof that what he was doing mattered, that the kindness he once received had multiplied into something much bigger than himself. Weeks later, the community center hosted another event to celebrate the success of their trainees. Robert came too, still the same kind man who had once stood stranded by the road. He gave Daniel a warm handshake and said, "You know, I never thought that night would lead to all this." Daniel chuckled. "Neither did I just stopped because it felt like the right thing to do." Robert smiled. Funny how the right thing often turns out to be the most important one. During the event, one of the trainees gave a short speech. He mentioned how Daniel's patience and kindness had changed his life. The crowd applauded and Daniel sat there quietly, humbled and grateful. He wasn't someone who liked being the center of attention, but hearing their words filled him with pride. After the event, as everyone was leaving, Robert said, "You've built something that's going to outlast both of us, Daniel." You turned a small moment into a movement. Daniel didn't know what to say. He just smiled and replied, "I just wanted to give back what was given to me." That night, Daniel took another walk. He ended up near the same old stretch of road again, the one that had changed everything. The air was still, and the sound of distant traffic echoed softly. He closed his eyes and remembered that cold night when he'd first met Robert. If someone had told him back then that this was where he'd end up, running a successful shop, helping others, rebuilding his family, he wouldn't have believed it. But life, he realized, had a way of surprising you when you least expect it. He thought about all the choices he'd made, the ones that hurt, the ones that healed, and the one that saved him, stopping for a stranger. When he got home, he sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the lights of passing cars. He thought about how many people might be out there just like he once was, tired, broken, feeling invisible. Maybe they just needed someone to stop for them. A few days later, Daniel decided to expand the training program. With Robert's help, they opened a small extension in another neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it gave more people a chance to learn and rebuild. Daniel spent his evenings there, teaching and listening just as he always had. One evening, after a long day, one of the new trainees asked him, "Why do you do this? You could just run the garage and live comfortably." Daniel smiled gently. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't think I deserved it. And I learned that the best way to thank them is to keep helping others." The trainee nodded thoughtfully, and Daniel could see that the words had reached him. He knew that maybe years from now that young man would remember this conversation the same way he remembered his with Robert. And so, life went on, quietly, steadily, beautifully. Daniel never sought fame or praise. He just wanted to live a life that meant something. He had come from pain and loss, but he had turned it into purpose. On the second anniversary of that fateful night, Daniel visited the roadside again, not out of sadness, but gratitude. The weather was calm, the air cool. He placed a small stone by the side of the road as a quiet reminder, a symbol of how something so small could mark a turning point. As he stood there, a car slowed behind him. A man leaned out the window and called, "Everything all right?" Daniel turned and smiled. "All good, friend. Just remembering something important." The man nodded and drove off, and Daniel chuckled softly. It was almost poetic, the kindness coming full circle once again. When he walked back to his car, he took one last look at the empty road. He whispered to himself, "Sometimes saving someone else really is how you find your way back to yourself." Then he drove off, the road stretching ahead like a promise of more simple, quiet miracles waiting to happen. Years later, people in town still talked about Daniel, the mechanic who turned his life around by helping a stranger. But if you asked him, he'd just say he was an ordinary man who made one small choice on one cold night. And that choice, simple as it was, became the story of his life. Years passed quietly, like pages in a well-loved book turning on their own. The city had changed a little, new buildings had risen, and people moved faster than they used to, but Daniel stayed the same in the ways that mattered. He was older now, with streaks of gray in his hair and gentle lines on his face, but his eyes still held the same warmth, the kind that made people feel safe when they spoke to him. The garage he once managed had grown into something far bigger than he ever dreamed. There were now 3 branches across the city, and the community training center had helped dozens of young men and women find steady jobs and a new start. Whenever Daniel walked through one of the workshops, he'd see people laughing, learning, and working together. That sound, the steady rhythm of hammers, laughter, and conversation, had become the music of his life. He wasn't the kind of man to take credit, though. Whenever someone praised him, he'd just smile and say, "It's not about me. It's about what we build together." But even with all the good around him, Daniel sometimes found himself thinking back to how it all began. The lonely night, the broken car, and the stranger he'd stopped to help. That memory stayed sharp, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. It reminded him of how fragile life could be, and how one small act of kindness could turn into something extraordinary. One afternoon, Daniel sat in his small office at the main garage, looking at old photos pinned to the wall. There were pictures of his team, of students from the program, and even one of him and his son on a fishing trip. Each one told a story of a life rebuilt piece by piece. As he looked around, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was one of the new trainees, a young woman named Lily. She stood nervously in the doorway. "Daniel, do you have a minute?" He nodded and motioned for her to sit. She hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to thank you. I was in a really bad place before I joined this program. I didn't think I could do anything right. But you believed in me. You don't know how much that means." Daniel smiled gently. "You did the hard part, Lily. You showed up and didn't give up. That's all anyone can ask." She nodded, her eyes bright. "I want to do what you do one day, help people. Make them believe in themselves again." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. "You already started," he said softly. After she left, he sat quietly for a long time. It hit him then that what he had started was no longer just his story. It had become a chain reaction of hope. Every person who found strength through the program was carrying that light forward, spreading it further than he ever could alone. Later that week, Robert visited him again. They hadn't seen each other for a few months, but the bond between them was still strong. Robert looked around the busy shop and smiled. "You know, I remember when this was just one small garage with barely enough tools to fix a tire." Daniel laughed. "Yeah, and now look at it. Sometimes I still can't believe it." Robert leaned against the wall, watching the team work. "You've done something rare, Daniel. You've built a legacy, not through money or fame, but through people." Daniel looked thoughtful. "It doesn't feel like mine. It feels like it belongs to everyone who believed, everyone who tried." Robert nodded slowly. "That's exactly why it works." A few days later, Daniel was invited to speak at a local event about community rebuilding. He wasn't used to public speaking, but he agreed. When he stepped up to the small stage that evening, he looked out at the faces in the audience. Some were students, some were business owners, and some were just neighbors curious about the man they'd heard so much about. He took a deep breath and began. "I don't have a fancy story," he said. "I just stopped one night to help a stranger with a flat tire. That moment changed my life. Not because I expected anything in return, but because it reminded me that kindness still matters." He spoke about struggle, second chances, and how helping others helped him find himself again. The room was silent, the kind of silence that comes when people really listen. When he finished, the audience stood and clapped, but Daniel didn't bask in it. He just smiled, thanked them, and stepped down quietly. He didn't need recognition. He just wanted people to see what was possible when compassion guided the way. Later that night, he took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The city lights glowed softly and the air was cool against his face. He thought about how many people walked these same streets carrying unseen burdens, how many just needed someone to see them. Even for a moment, he remembered how invisible he once felt, and he whispered to himself, "No one should ever feel that way again." That became his next mission. Over the following months, Daniel started a small outreach project with a few friends from the garage. They visited shelters and schools, offering basic repair lessons and mentoring. It wasn't just about teaching skills, it was about reminding people that they still had worth. One evening, after a long day at the outreach center, Daniel sat on the steps outside with one of the older volunteers. The man looked at him and said, "You know, you could have just fixed cars and lived a quiet life. Why go this far?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Because someone once stopped for me when they didn't have to. I just want to keep that going." The volunteer nodded slowly. "You're one of the good ones, Daniel." Daniel looked out at the street, watching the headlights pass by. "I don't think there are good ones or bad ones. Just people, some who are lost and some who stop to help them find their way." Time moved on and Daniel grew older. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the long hours at the garage began to tire him more quickly. But his heart was still strong. When the time came, he decided to step back from running the day-to-day operations. He handed over the leadership to a few of the younger ones he'd trained over the years. On his last official day, the team surprised him with a small celebration. They gave him a framed photo of everyone who had ever worked with him, with a simple message written underneath. "You fixed more than cars. You fixed lives." Daniel smiled and tried not to tear up. "You all did that," he said softly. "I just started the engine." After the celebration, he locked up the shop one last time and took a slow walk home. The streets were quiet, and the evening sky was painted with streaks of orange and gold. He passed by the same old road again, the one where everything began. He stopped for a moment, looking out over the empty stretch of asphalt. The memories came rushing back. The cold night, the broken car, the stranger's grateful smile. It felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. He whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, not just for what he'd gained, but for what he'd learned. He realized then that life wasn't about what you had or lost. It was about the moments when you reached out, when you gave a piece of yourself without expecting anything back. Those were the moments that defined a life. When he finally reached home, his son was there waiting with a warm dinner. They sat together, talking and laughing. His son told him about his own family, his children, and the lessons he was passing on to them. Daniel listened, smiling. When his son said, "I tell my kids about you sometimes, how one small act can change everything," Daniel's heart swelled with quiet pride. That night, before bed, Daniel looked out the window at the city lights. They flickered softly, like tiny reminders of all the people out there, each living their own stories, each waiting for their moment of kindness. He whispered to himself, "Maybe the best way to live is to keep helping, even when no one's watching." And with that thought, he smiled and turned off the light. The night outside was calm, and somewhere on some quiet road, another story like his was just beginning.